I'm super excited to be here. I think it's so impactful and meaningful that you all are choosing to spend your time. I asked Clemente and Robinson before this if you were getting continuing education credits or anything, and you're just here out of your own interest, and that is so awesome. So I'm excited to be here. I'm glad you're here. And I think this is a really important topic, and I'm excited to get going. But before we begin, I do want to give a little bit of overview of who I am, more holistically than just sort of a bio and a talk, because, an hour together, it's nice to know who's talking, you're talking with. So my name is Keaton Fletcher. I'm an assistant professor of industrial organizational psychology at the Georgia Institute of Technology down here in Atlanta, where it is currently colder than it is in New York, apparently. So I have to bundle up when I go outside, but hopefully you're doing okay. I also consider myself an occupational health psychologist, where I focus really on how work impacts our health. And that includes both physical health and mental health, and how we can bring our whole selves to work and also make sure that work contributes to our whole selves rather than detracts. Speaking of whole selves, I think it's also nice when doing these professional talks to show that we're more than just our jobs. So my partner, my wife, Dr. Kimberly French, is also an IO psychologist and occupational health psychologist at Georgia Tech. We've got 2 adorable cats and 2 even more adorable children who keep us very busy. And I'm sure I'll be referencing at some point in these talks because it's hard to draw those connections to your personal life. And so that's sort of what I'm bringing to the table. And hopefully you find what we're going to be talking about today interesting. So sort of to set the stage, I'm sure I don't need to convince you that mental health in the workplace is an important topic, but just in case I do, we see that it's increasingly being talked about. For example, the World Health Organization and President Biden both announced mental health crises and mental health epidemics, and that we really need to focus on mental health. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, recently released a Mental Health in America, a workplace report, really focusing on mental health in the workplace, where they found that about a quarter of employees report symptoms of depression and hopelessness, which to me is wild. That's a staggering statistic. 41% report symptoms of burnout, which again is staggering. And about a third of people that have these symptoms report having done nothing to deal with them, right? Nothing to cope with them, which is, again, very concerning. And so hopefully today we'll give you some tools and strategies both to protect your own mental health, but also that of your coworkers and colleagues. Whoop. Nope, I don't want to open up that link. The goals here for the day is to understand the stress process. I am a professor at the end of the day, so I can't give a talk without talking about the science a little bit explicitly. I geek out about this, so I'm going to try to keep it higher level. Understand what's under your control. We're living in a world right now where there's not a whole lot in our control that's stressful, and that includes in our workplaces. There are just some things that we can't change, but there are things that we can, and that includes our reactions. So we're going to be talking about what we can change for yourself, but also change in your working environment for your coworkers and your direct reports. We're going to tackle tough issues like mental illness and COVID. Again, I'm the PSYOP Trend 9 champion. So the Trend 9 is mental health in the workplace, separate from well-being. And so I want to, hammer home mental illness, mental health explicitly. And then also, again, dovetail into COVID. I feel like you can't give one of these talks without talking about how COVID has changed everything, but also nothing. And then lastly, talk a little bit about policies and practices. Maybe you don't have the power yourself to change policies, but certainly, you can advocate for policy change, talk to your HR people, and then certainly change practices within your own unit and your own sort of engagement in the workplace. So laying the groundwork, the science, when we talk about how our work impacts our health, one of the main ways that we talk about it is basically our good buckets and our bad buckets. And at work, we think of job demands as things that really require energy, require resources from us, and can ultimately, if left unchecked, result in negative mental health outcomes and negative physical health outcomes. There's a lot of work that shows that job demands are associated with illness, pain, loss of function, disability, things along those lines, in addition to, mental health outcomes like depression, anxiety, burnout, and stress. So what are job demands? These include things like feeling overloaded. You have too many tasks on your plate, Clemente and I were just talking right before the talk started about how we both have too much to do and not enough time. And so I think we're both in a state of overload. And that seems to be sort of a constant state for most of us these days. Ambiguity is a stressor, is a job demand here, where if it's not clear what's expected of you, that's really stressful. We as humans don't like ambiguity, and that is a demand that we have to overcome and cope with. If you have conflicting responsibilities, or even just the more responsibility you have, that's a job demand. Time pressure, so if you have a lot of deadlines, that can be really stressful. And demanding. If you're being mistreated by your coworkers, your supervisors, maybe students or clients, that is obviously a demand and stressful and something that you need to overcome. And then physical demands. We often think of physical demands in the workplace like carrying 50-pound loads from here to there, but even an office job where you're sitting in a chair for an extended period of time is a physical demand. Typing on the keyboard's a physical demand, things along those lines. But it's not all just bad parts of your job. We have components of the workplace that can result in positive outcomes themselves, or can reduce the negative outcomes of these job demands. So a component of the job is job control. So how much flexibility do you have over when and where you work, what you're doing? And then autonomy. What degree of choice do you have? What degree of power can you exert in the workplace over what you're doing? And then support. And this is really how we can support one another in the workplace, how you're being supported by your organization, how you're being supported by your supervisor, and how you're being supported by your coworkers. And we'll dive deep into support here in a little bit. But just know that this is one of the key components in buffering these negative effects of job demands on our mental and physical health. What's really interesting, I think, that I want to hammer home too, is that stress is very individualized. There's no such thing really as an objective stressor, that this event, this experience is equally stressful for all people all the time. What we're bringing to the table in any given moment changes, and within person and between people, right? And so something like overload, that Clemente and I were joking about before, someone on one end of the spectrum might thrive in that experience of overload and find it not stressful at all. Someone else on the other end of the spectrum might be at the end of a nervous breakdown, right? They're ready to just quit their job and walk away from everything, from the same amount of work, the same amount of overload. But it also changes day to day, right? If you wake up after a nice, refreshing night of sleep, I don't remember what that's like since I've got 2 young kids, you might feel ready to address all that overload you have in the workplace, or these other job demands. Or, you wake up groggy, you woke up 10 times in the middle of the night because your kids were crying, they were sick, and you're stressed about your finances. You're not bringing to the table the same resources, so that stressor is more stressful for you, right? And so I think that is one of the most interesting components of this, that can really help us empathize better with each other and also ourselves, recognizing that these experiences that maybe I could handle yesterday that I'm not able to handle today, that's okay. You're bringing different things to the table today, but also not making assumptions about what other people can handle. But broadly, when we think about these stressors, right, we can maybe say, nope, this isn't stressful for me today. I've got the resources, I'm well rested, I've got the things that I need to deal with it, and it's not going to result in stress, whatever it is. But on the other hand, if you find it stressful, now we're sort of activating our fight or flight systems, right? It's something that either you need to be able to overcome, or something that you need to just cope with. And so what we see is, if you feel like it's something that you can overcome, you can learn and grow from it, you view it as a challenge. And in the long run, exposure to these challenges can actually be beneficial. There is this sort of notion of stress inoculation, where you're building up resources, you're building up skills by overcoming challenges. I love to give the analogy when I teach this to my classes of going to the gym. At the gym, you're on the bench press, you're lifting a really heavy bar with weights on it that's just outside of something that you're comfortable with, and you have to work really hard and you get there, right? You're expending resources in the moment. It's stressful. Your body is literally under stress. You might be sore. It might hurt, but in the long run, you're getting stronger. You're feeling better about yourself, and you're gaining from it. And we can take that same notion and apply it to these more social stressors like job demands, right? Overcoming a really stressful deadline or a really stressful period in the workplace. If you have the resources for it, you did it. Now you feel more efficacious. You learned maybe some new skills, and you're better for it, even though in the moment it was stressful. So we don't want to avoid all stressors. But on the other hand, there are some stressors that we just don't have the resources to deal with. And that might be in the moment or ever. And these we consider threats, right? And by not overcoming them, we're really going to lose resources. And there's nothing that we can do to overcome them. And it's particularly stressful, right? These never result in positive outcomes. And we want to minimize our exposure to these. So imagine again in the gym, this is like trying to lift 500 pounds without any sort of lifting experience. That's just going to crush you. It's only going to result in negative outcomes for you, right? And same thing with these job demands. If you are loaded up on overload, ambiguity, time pressure, and mistreatment, you're not going to be able to overcome those. They're just going to threaten you. And now you're going to start to experience these negative outcomes. So we really want to minimize our exposure to these threats, or make sure that we have the resources we need to overcome the stressors so we are able to view them more as challenges. And then there's sort of this weird third bucket of stressors that we consider hindrances. And these are things that you can overcome. Maybe they're easy to overcome, maybe they're hard to overcome, but like you definitely have the resources to deal with them, but you're not going to gain anything from it. So this is like bureaucratic red tape. Maybe this is something like prejudice in the workplace where you are able to overcome the experience of being stigmatized, but you know what, you're not gaining anything from it. It's still a negative experience. You didn't gain new skills. It doesn't make you feel better. And so we also want to minimize our exposure to these, right? And so I know that I said that stress is very individualized, but there are some stressors that tend to be more viewed as challenges, more viewed as threats, or more viewed as hindrances. And so what we see, some challenge type stressors include things like autonomy, right? Having power and control over your job, that is stressful, right? It's a little bit more responsibility, but in the long run, it tends to be good for you. Being able to be involved in decision-making in the workplace, having responsibility for others. These are all good things. You know, even some deadlines, right? Some time stress, some task load stress can all be good in moderation. We see in the short run, it is associated with increased alcohol consumption because it is stressful, but in the long run, we see it's associated with generally better well-being outcomes, improved performance in the workplace, and improved motivation. Threats, on the other hand, tend to include things like conflict, abuse or mistreatment, prejudice in the workplace, and these result in psychological distress, emotional exhaustion and anxiety, as well as a range of other negative outcomes. And again, we just want to minimize our exposure to these. Hindrances, on the other hand, these are competing demands, ambiguous expectations, lack of support from your supervisors or coworkers, bureaucracy, right? That red tape, lack of supplies, being asked to do something without being given the resources you need to do it. That's just a hindrance. We see it's associated with a range of negative health behaviors in the short term, and then in the long run, associated with worsened performance, worsened motivation, increased stress. So, not all stressors are built equally, and then not everyone from moment to moment experiences these stressors the same. And I think recognizing that, this nuanced distinction between different types of stressors, and that different people view things differently, and within ourselves we view things differently, can really help make us better coworkers and more supportive coworkers, and also can help us protect our own mental health and well-being. So I sort of laid the groundwork and said, if you have to be exposed to stressors, we want them to be challenges, but even challenges themselves can sort of overdo it, right? If you don't have enough challenging stressors in your workplace, you're bored, you don't know what to do, you're probably gonna look for a different job because this isn't stimulating. Being bored is a negative experience. On the other end, if you are loaded up with, typically challenge stressors that we talked about before, now you're overwhelmed, you're anxious, and you're also not performing at your max, you're gonna have negative health outcomes. So you have to find your sweet spot. And that sweet spot, again, is gonna be different from person to person and from day to day, depending on what you're bringing to the table. And so sort of just checking in with yourself, checking in with others to see where we're at, what can we accomplish today, how can we get into that sweet spot. And one really cool thing about finding that sweet spot is it might help you experience this really interesting psychological state called flow. I feel like flow has sort of made it into popular discourse. If you're listening to podcasts or self-help type books or things, flow sort of made it into that realm. But in case you're not familiar, flow is a generally positive state where you're experiencing enjoyment and challenge, you have clear goals and feedback, and you have sort of this loss of time. So something that people might be able to experience this with is like playing video games that are designed to be just past your ability, right? So you're focused and in, and then you look up and suddenly it's dawn, right? I haven't felt that since a teenager with video games, but that's okay. One thing that I experience this with is data coding, right? Or data analysis, where you're in it, you're problem solving, you're solving the logic, and then suddenly you look around and you're like, oh my gosh, it's been like 4 hours, I haven't moved, I haven't eaten. that was, that was fun. I feel tired, but like, man, that was good. And so finding ways to have that experience in the workplace by sort of aligning these challenges to match or just exceed the resources that you have, so you can enter that state of flow. And again, you have to be really intentional about it to experience the state, to not go too far over, too far under. And but I think having that knowledge of what the state is and the benefit of getting into it can really help make work an additive experience to your life rather than a subtractive experience. But what about the times when you can't sort of navigate these stressors, put yourself into a period where you can experience flow or an ideal level of challenges? You're just stressed. And this is when we have to learn how to cope. And we all have different coping mechanisms that we use. Some of us has more, some of us have fewer. Some of us tend to use ones that have better outcomes. Some of us tend to have ones that use worse outcomes. But generally in the literature, we think of two main buckets of coping mechanisms. Both are really useful. We have our problem-focused coping skills and our emotion-focused coping skills. Problem-focused are the ones that really focus on removing the stressor from our life. They're what we're doing to overcome that challenge, to separate that threat from our world, to overcome those hindrances and make sure they don't happen again. So this might involve like creating a plan, doing the task, soliciting additional resources or help, anything that really helps you overcome that stressor and make sure that you're leaving it in the past. Emotion-focused coping really focuses, instead of on the stressor, on how we're reacting to the stressor, right? I mean, stressors are stressful, right? And that is a negative experience. And if we lose ourselves in that negative experience, that just makes it worse. There's this adage of like, why lose a whole day to something that only lasted 10 minutes, right? If you are focused on this and a negative experience, maybe you had a conflict at work and now you're ruminating about it for the whole day, you just took a small stressor and made it last for 24 hours, right? So emotion-focused coping is really focusing in on your emotions and making sure that they are beneficial and functioning for you, right? And the issues with coping is when you have sort of a mismatch between our approach to coping and the stressor itself. So if you are emotion-focused coping exclusively with a stressor that you should just do and get it done with, then you're going to have worse outcomes, right? And so I like to think of this as like procrastinating, right? There's papers that I have to write, there's emails that I have to send, and like I just don't want to do it. And so instead I'll be like, go eat some chocolate and focus on how I'm feeling and meditate. And like that's great. That makes me feel better in the moment. But in the long run, like that stressor's still there. Instead, I should be focusing on problem-focused coping, getting that stressor out of my life, right? But on the other hand, maybe there's stressors that you can't overcome. Maybe you are chronically insecure in your job, or you don't have enough money, or you are experiencing prejudice in the workplace and there's just nothing that you can do about it. Maybe problem-focused coping isn't going to serve you well. Instead, we can focus on our emotions, help ourselves cope to a degree that is beneficial for ourselves. And so what we see with coping is really, it's about the breadth of coping skills that you have, the different types of coping behaviors that you have learned to use and engage in, the better off you are. Because if you bring a screwdriver to every sort of tool that you need to use. Oh, this analogy is falling apart, but the idea is there, right? Like you can't use a screwdriver for every issue, right? Or you can't use a hammer for every issue. A nail requires a hammer, flathead screw requires a flathead screwdriver, and a Phillips head requires a Phillips head. And so if you have all those in your toolbox, you're going to be better off. But this extrapolates too into how we support one another. So we take this notion of problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping and now turn it into problem-focused support and emotion-focused support. And we can think of support as either being direct, where I'm literally helping you with the thing, or indirect, where I'm giving you the resources you need to help yourself. And all of these are beneficial, right? And so instrumental support is, problem-focused and direct. I'm going to use an analogy of moving. So if your friend needs to move, that's a stressful experience. Instrumental support here would be, you're going to help them pack boxes. You're going to help them lift things and put them in the moving truck and then unpack boxes. You're literally helping them overcome that stressor, remove it from their life themselves, right? Task oriented, getting it out of the way, getting it done. Emotional support would be where they're stressed out, they know that they have to move, they're pretty bummed, and you're a shoulder to cry on. You're letting them express their emotions in a safe environment, non-judgmental, and you're there, and that's really useful as well. The indirect support is where it gets a little bit more confusing, I think. Informational support is where, they say, I need to move. And you say, listen, sorry, I can't help you move. I've got a bad back, or I'm out of town when you're moving, but I know a guy who's got a truck. And so here's the information, or I know someone who has people who are just looking for an easy workout. And so here you go. And it's up to them to make those connections and get the resources that they need. We can think about that in the workplace too. Maybe someone's complaining about a really stressful task, and you don't have the capacity to help them with that task, or you don't have the ability to help them with that task, but you know someone who does, or a place where they can go, right? I saw this great YouTube video about that particular technology issue, or here's this really useful forum that has answers typically to that type of issue. And then they get to go and use those resources that you've now given them. And then appraisal support is where you help other people change how they're viewing that stressor, right? So if your friend comes to you, they're really stressed about moving, instead of being the shoulder to cry on, you're saying, oh, hey, man, maybe it's a really cool opportunity. Have you thought about things that you're excited about moving? Have you thought about reframing it as an experience rather than a stressor, as a positive thing? And then it's up to them to do the heavy emotional lifting of reappraising their stressor, or reappraising their job. But you've at least sort of opened that door for them. And this is all great ways to be a really supportive coworker. But one of the issues is when we have mismatch in support, just like when we have mismatch in coping. And so one thing you want to do is ask people, how can I best support you? We're not always the best at knowing what we need, but we're, just asking is better than guessing, right? Because what someone else needs in a particular situation might not be what you would need in that situation. We can't assume that, well, if I were moving, I would just want someone to help me move. But they might just want to be a shoulder to cry on, right? And this is something I bring into my relationship with my partner, right? Of, I'm someone who loves to just go fix the problem, but sometimes she just wants to be like, this was an annoying thing that happened at work. And so I have to be like, is this, are you asking me for can I help you problem solve? Or do you just want me to listen? She'd be like, I just want you to listen. And then, that's more helpful, because what we know, there's some pretty cool work in the workplace that shows that unhelpful support is actually more problematic than no support sometimes. So if you're giving people support that they don't want or need, you're actually maybe potentially slowing down their work, stopping them from making progress on what they're trying to do, overcome the stressor. And so you really want to check in both with yourself, what you're able to give, and check in with them, what they need, and sort of match it into these different domains would be particularly helpful. One thing that I think we can think about with all of this in mind is how can we make work meet our psychological needs? I think we've all been exposed to Maslow's hierarchy of needs to some degree in pop culture, or maybe, intro to psychology in college. But in our field in industrial organizational psychology, we really think about, it's called self-determination theory. That's not important for you. But these three basic psychological needs that we need to get met. And work can really help us meet these needs. So we have a need for competence. We want to feel effective and capable, like we can do things. We have a need for autonomy, where we want to feel like we're in control of our lives and our decisions. And we have a need for relatedness. No matter how introverted you are, no matter how much of a loner you are, you need some close, meaningful relationships. And work can really help us satisfy all these needs. Think back to when we first had those lockdowns, when COVID first hit. We weren't going to the workplace. And so we all took up, baking sourdough bread. That met our need for competence. You have this new skill, you get to see this output. You're like, yeah, I learned something new. I'm good at making bread. We set up Zoom happy hours with our friends, or went for masked park walks, because we have that need for relatedness that usually we get met in the workplace, but it wasn't being met. And so we had to find ways to meet it. And then autonomy, that might be one thing that when we shifted to working remotely was a need that we now suddenly had met 100%, right? Of oh, I've got autonomy over when and where I work and how I work. This is lovely. And that's why now, as we're sort of transitioning back into working in person, it feels like letting go of something that you really liked. And there's such a struggle about going back because you were meeting that need. And so now it's finding a way to help ourselves continue to meet these needs. And what we see is that when these needs are met by our work, people tend to be less exhausted. They tend to be a better employee broadly. They enjoy the job, which isn't that nice if you can enjoy your job, and have better well-being broadly as well. And so we're going to keep coming back to these needs. throughout the rest of the talk. One way to help ourselves meet these needs or help our coworkers meet these needs is tailoring your job to your own needs, right? Customizing your job. We call this job crafting. And so when you sign on for a new job, you have a list of tasks and duties and responsibilities. But over time, as you're in a position, it's open to shift and change. And if you can be intentional about that process, making sure that the way that your job shifts and change is doing so in a way that helps you meet your needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence, you're going to be able to tailor your job to be an additive component of your life rather than a subtractive one. So some approach-oriented job crafting tasks that you can do, you can take on new duties that you're particularly interested in. Maybe you love data coding as much as I do. And so a data coding project comes to your team and you're like, I will take that one. But maybe you're going to couple this then with some avoidance-oriented job crafting where you'll be intentional about shedding some duties. Say, if I'm going to take on this new responsibility, I need to offload some of these other tasks because we don't want to get overloaded, right? We don't want to have too many of those challenge stressors. Or maybe you don't want to take on a new duty, or it's very clear what duties and responsibilities are, or how those are divided. Maybe you can take on a new social role, help meet that relatedness need of yours. So you now view yourself as sort of the party planner for the group. Hey, let's all get together for happy hours after work. Or, hey, let's all go to lunch together. And you're the one organizing that, coordinating that. There's some other strategies here. I don't feel the need to go through all those. You can read just as well as I can. But I will share the original study on job crafting. I think it's so interesting, was looking at janitorial staff in a healthcare setting. And so it was looking at things that they did to maximize their enjoyment of their job and view it as additive. And so some things they would do would be take it upon themselves to talk to patients while they were there. They're like, sometimes we're the only social interaction they have. The nurses and doctors are just in about the tasks. I view it as part of my role and responsibility to provide that social interaction with patients. And if you viewed that, took that on, that's meeting those psychological needs, and they were better off. But you can also reframe how you think about your jobs. You don't necessarily have to change anything about the job itself. You could just change how you view it. Part of the janitorial staff that viewed their jobs as like an integral part of the healthcare system. They say, I'm not the one necessarily directly providing care, but I'm making sure that this is a safe, clean environment for patients. My role is integral to this patient's healthcare. They had better health outcomes, better well-being outcomes, and better job outcomes than their partners who are like, I'm just a janitor, quote unquote, right? And so maybe one thing, that we need to do is take stock of how our job fits into the broader spectrum, the broader field. As a professor, I often find that what does publishing one more paper do? Who's going to read this other than other IOs? And so it's things like this, taking on extra tasks, like giving a talk to people who are interested and excited, or, I run a podcast because I want to, or just reframing of I get to inform the lives of the students that I teach, and hopefully shape their perspectives of the world. That cognitive reformation can help me be more engaged in my job and get more out of it. Again, viewing your work as an additive experience. And we can help each other do this, right? Going back to that social support, you can engage in that appraisal support with your coworkers, helping them sort of reframe their work. But at the end of the day, work is stressful. It does demand things of us. It does require things from us. And so we need to recover. We need to take our time off from work when we're home to recover, but we also need to recover during the day. This is especially important if we are working remotely, where we tend to forget that we need to take breaks, right? For some reason, when we're home, we feel guilty when we use the bathroom or have lunch because no one can see us working. But at work, you wouldn't feel that way. You would be happy to go to the restroom or the water cooler or lunch. And so what are some recovery activities that we can engage in? The first and foremost is sleep. Sleep is so important. There's so many studies about how sleep is critical to your health, to your happiness, to your job functioning. It makes you a better employee. And for a lot of us, it feels like our sleep is out of our control. But there is a set of behaviors called sleep hygiene behaviors that we can engage in that at least increase our likelihood of having good sleep quality and quantity. So going to bed at the same time every day, waking up at the same time every day, not doing work shortly before bed, not doing any sort of arousing activities like exercise or getting into heated debates right before bed, only using your bed for sleep and sex, making sure that you're sleeping in a comfortable environment, both temperature-wise and safety-wise, no exposure to blue light just before bed, take your phone, put it in a different room, use an old school alarm clock if you have to. I'm so bad about this. My phone is the last thing I look at when I go to sleep and the first thing I look at when I wake up, and that's just so bad for your sleep. So protect your sleep, do what you can. Then also engage in physical activity, right? This doesn't have to be going to the gym. It can be things like going for a walk in the park, but you can also view it as a way to meet those psychological needs, right? So maybe you do a social physical activity, you join a run club, you go for a walk with your friends or your partner, you do something that helps you get a sense of competence, right? Maybe you like join a CrossFit gym and you really learn new skills there or something, whatever it is for you. But viewing physical activity as a way to meet these psychological needs as well. And then relaxing is really important too. I think we do tend to fall into the habit of just getting home, turning on Netflix, and then suddenly our night went by. And so thinking about how you can be intentional about how you relax, getting the most out of it. So rather than, potato chips, we're having mashed potatoes as far as our relaxing experience, right? And so not Netflix, but instead maybe we are doing mindfulness activities, or you're splurging on a massage if you're able to, or you or your partner are going to give each other massages, and that can help you meet that relatedness need in addition to relaxation need. Or maybe you take up a hobby that you find particularly relaxing, like knitting or something like that. Meeting those needs for mastery, right? Have a hobby. We talked about baking bread, etc. Something that meets those mastery needs, social needs, doing social activities. I know my partner and I, we view the weekend sort of as an opportunity. One day is about social activities, recharging that need, and the other day is about relaxation and sort of cleaning and recharging those needs. And so really making time for social activities, even though they might be draining in the moment, you still have to fill that sim bar, right? You still have to meet those needs. And then one of the most important components too is detaching. And this is, again, where as coworkers and supervisors, we can really hold each other accountable. So it's so easy to always work. I think in our fields of work, it's always accessible. We can take it home with us, and that's just not good, right? And even if we're not taking our work home with us, we're taking it home in our minds, right? We're thinking about work, we're ruminating about work. And especially when we're working from home, we lose some of the rituals that help us disengage, right? We lose our commute, which is an opportunity for us to sort of signal to ourselves it's time to be at work or it's time to be at home. And so thinking of ways to intentionally detach. You're shutting your laptop, you're turning off your phone or turning off your email. You have some sort of routine to help you disengage and detach. If you catch yourself ruminating about work, you say, okay, that's okay to think about that, but I choose not to right now, and let that sort of drift away. And then just don't work when you shouldn't be working, right? It can wait until tomorrow. So that brings us to some current issues. I really want to talk about mental illness in the workplace and a little bit of how COVID has changed things, or really just exacerbated things that were already there. Because I would be remiss as the Trend 9 champion to not talk about mental illness in the workplace. And so I want to highlight that mental illness is legally covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't be fired for having mental illness or reporting mental illness. You should have reasonable accommodations for this, for mental illness. And that includes things like neurodivergence, right? That's autism, ADHD, long COVID, right? If you have long COVID symptoms like brain fog, things like that, that's covered here as well under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But not everyone with a disability, including mental illness, discloses in the workplace, right? Some reasons people report for not disclosing is a fear of exclusion or discrimination, right? People don't want to be rejected by their peers or their supervisors or be viewed differently if they disclose having a mental illness or a disability. But also feelings of privacy, right? This is me for myself, like I can deal with this. You don't get this part of me. Maybe it's not the norm in the workplace, right? It's not normal for us to disclose. One thing that gives me heart is that that's been changing, I think, lately. I've looked around sort of in the culture the last 5 years or so, and I think people are more open about mental illness, mental health, disabilities, things like autism, ADHD. I was in a meeting the other day with my lab, and it was so cool. There were 6 of us, and 4 of us were talking about, well, here's my experience with my different therapists, and that's something that I don't think would have happened 5 years ago. And so creating a norm where it's okay to disclose. There are reasons to disclose, right? You want those accommodations, you want those support, right? Mental illness, mental health challenges, disabilities need support, right? You need accommodations, and you can't get those if you don't ask. And then also for many people with mental illness or disabilities, it's part of your identity. You don't want to feel like you have to mask at work. You don't want to have to hide this key component of who you are, especially something like neurodivergence. You don't want to feel like you have to put on that mask and pretend that you're someone else. We see a similar pattern of masking and lack of authenticity and the negative outcomes of that at work for people who are LGBTQ, you or other invisible stigmatized groups that can't be their truly authentic selves at work or feel like they can't be, results in negative outcomes in the long run. So you want to create an environment where people can be their true selves. And then when you do choose to disclose, there are some strategies to make it more effective for you, right? You don't want to downplay your symptoms or your needs, right? That's sort of our gut instinct is like, yeah, I have this, but it's really not that bad. I don't need that much. You want to ask for what you need, right? It can help if you claim it as part of your identity, right? So I'm an individual, with ADHD, or I'm an autistic person, right? Something like that can help you, again, feel more authentic, meet those psychological needs, and make this a more successful disclosure experience. And then being straightforward rather than emotional, right? Coming out or disclosing on your own terms intentionally rather than, sort of in a moment of frustration or in a moment of panic or fear. On the other hand, what do we do as coworkers when someone discloses mental illness or a mental disability to us? We can be supportive or unsupportive is basically the two main buckets. And you'll see some of these look very similar to our different types of support, right? We can help be empathetic, trusting, provide appraisal support, right? Positive affirmation and feedback towards people, giving advice or suggestions of resources in the workplace that might help you meet those needs if they want, right? I always ask if, how can I help you? What are you expecting here, right? You don't want to be pedantic or paternalistic, or providing instrumental support. If you're in a place where you can provide tangible resources that can help people meet their accommodations in the workplace, great, do that as well. We don't want to do things like insult people or deny, right? If someone discloses to you a mental illness, don't pretend that they didn't or never have that conversation again. Don't change the subject. Don't deny assistance if they're requesting it. Certainly, maybe not all accommodations can be met, but you can negotiate, find something that you can provide. And then obviously don't fire people or exclude them socially if they disclose mental illness. What's also really interesting, and again, that component of like perspective taking, is that there's a gap between people without mental illness and the people with, and how they view these behaviors. So people without mental illness undervalue emotionally supportive behaviors. They tend to lean into those instrumental, informational, supportive behaviors when people disclose, whereas people with mental illness, when they disclose, really want that emotional support as well. And then people without mental illness tend to underestimate the negative impact of unsupportive behaviors, right? You kind of like brush it off, whereas people with mental illness are really impacted by this, right? And so again, just trying to empathize with your coworkers and colleagues when they disclose. And then also before they disclose, know that, a lot of people haven't yet disclosed to you. And so you want to be careful of how you're talking about mental illness in the workplace. Moving on to COVID-19, let's see, how am I doing on time? Kind of going to gloss over this. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. But we see that it's increased anxiety, it's increased depression, as has all the other things going on in the world. It's increased working from home, which Clemente informed me that you've already had one of these talks on. And we know that there's a differential outcome for who this was the worst for when supports weren't provided, right? So that working from home was worse for women or people who had children. But we know that it also can benefit people of stigmatized minority groups because now they're not experiencing daily microaggressions from their coworkers. And so as we work in return to the workplace, we want to be mindful of how we're doing that and recognize that not everyone has the same needs as we return. Yeah, I'm going to skip over the rest of this. Clement is going to give you the slides. If you're interested in the science, all of these citations are hyperlinked to the original papers. But one thing I do want to talk about, because we all have this, is Zoom fatigue, right? If you're anything like me, your calendar is just chock full of virtual meetings. And by the end of it, you just want to take a nap. And so there's some strategies that we can do as employees ourselves to protect ourselves from Zoom fatigue, or at least minimize it. And then things that we can do as coworkers and supervisors to help reduce Zoom fatigue for everyone around us, right? So when you're in a meeting, mute your microphone, take breaks from the meeting, have your camera off if at all possible, remove distractions. You don't want other things in the background, right? It's hard enough to focus on this virtual setting, but it's even worse when you have your email pinging in the background. And then one thing that we don't really talk about often is turning that self-view off. Most of the time when we have in-person meetings, we're not very aware of how we present ourselves because we're really focused on how other people are viewing the presenter, right? But now, because of Zoom, you can see yourself 100% of the time. And so now you're hyper aware. And so you're taking up brain space, you're taking up energy and resources not touching your face, not rubbing your nose, making sure that you're always smiling and looking attentive. And so just turn off that self view if you can, and that can help reduce Zoom fatigue. As coworkers and supervisors, we can hold our virtual meetings in the mornings. We know that Zoom fatigue is more likely in afternoon meetings. So put these virtual meetings in the mornings. Establish group norms about having cameras off or having cameras on if that's what we need, but being intentional about how we do that. Avoid back-to-back scheduling, making sure that people have time to engage in bodily functions that they need to, go use the restroom. Don't schedule over lunch because people won't eat, and we don't want that, and they feel awkward about eating on camera. And then, as always, does this meeting have to be a meeting or can it be an email? Because Zoom or other virtual technologies make meetings so easy, I think we're very quick to address everything with a virtual meeting. Does it have to be? Can it be a phone call? Can it be an email? If you're interested, I highly recommend the book, The Surprising Science of Meetings by Stephen Rogelberg. It was released before COVID, but I think it's even more applicable now. It's about how to run meetings efficiently. And the first thing is like, do you need a meeting for this? Super useful there. But when we work remotely, Clemente was telling me that you're back to, I think, 70% in person, 30% remote, or maybe switch that. But regardless, on the days that we're working remote, it's really easy for us to overwork, engage in what we call work creep. We saw this during COVID-19, people working longer hours than they would if we were in person. And so there's some things that we can do and can encourage each other to do and facilitate each other doing to create boundaries to make sure that we don't have work creep. So some behaviors that we can do, we can intentionally turn our technology off, shut our laptop, take our work email off of our phone, or at least put a timer on our work email so we don't get our work emails after hours. Triage, not everything that can be done today has to be done today. Some things can wait until tomorrow, and that's okay. Got to save something for your future self to do. And then establish routines. If you, on the days that you're working from home, you lose that commute as a normal routine, a way to engage and disengage, and we're just creatures of habit. We learn. And so create one for yourself for when you're at home. Maybe it's drinking a cup of coffee in your kitchen before you walk into your office or walk into the dining room where you're doing work. Or maybe you take a stroll around the block to your local bodega, you come back, and then boom, it's time to start working, right? Create that commute for yourself. Supervisors can limit off-work communication, right? Don't email people outside of regular work hours. Or if you are someone that does do that, make it very clear that there's no pressure to respond. Even put no pressure to respond in the subject line so people know that they don't need to look at it. Or liberally use the schedule email function. If you're someone like me, because I have two small kids, sometimes the only time I can work is like 9 p.m. to midnight, right? And so you can always set your email so it sends the next day at 9 a.m., right? No one needs to respond at midnight. And then one thing that we can do as well is create these individualized deals, allow job crafting, ask people what their needs are, and help them meet them, and recognize that it's not going to be the same for each one of your employees. Talking about space when you're working from home, have a designated space where you always work. That is your workspace. So then when you're not in it, you can really view yourself as at home. If you're lucky enough to have a home office, great. Make it, as nice of a home office as you can. If you're anything like me, you've got a small condo, not a whole lot of space to have a home office. And so I always work in the same space on the couch. Not great ergonomically, but at least it helps me transition to space. And again, if you at all possible, make sure it's not in your bedroom. And if it is in your bedroom, it's not in your bed. If you can, again, a physical space for transitions. And then let's see, managing time. I'm a big fan of the calendar system and literally putting in your calendar time to get your actual job done. Again, with all the ease with creating these virtual meetings, especially if other people have access to your calendars, is your day can just be full of meetings. And then when do you get your actual work done? At night? No, we don't. It's 2022. We're not doing that. So create a time in your workday that you are dedicated to getting your tasks done. One thing I've done is create a writing group, because writing is something that I can always push off for these other meetings, things like that. And I've scheduled it in my calendar, but I've also made it a meeting that other people who have to also get writing done are invited to. And so one, meeting relatedness. Two, there's that sense of oh no, this is a real meeting. I can't schedule things over this. And then two, it's in your calendar. Other people have to respect it as well. And then finding time within your workday and outside of your workday to rest and recover, value respite. Don't feel guilty going to the bathroom. Don't feel guilty having a full lunch break. You wouldn't feel guilty doing it if you were in the workplace. So you shouldn't feel guilty at home. If we have variable schedules, as a supervisor, maybe we can do our best to reliably schedule. Ambiguous or unreliable schedules are really stressful and challenging, so that's an issue. If you can provide control over scheduling, does everyone really have to work 9 to 5? Or really, do you just need everyone 11 to 1, and then we can sort of flex out in different directions? Or it's just about getting your work done. Thinking about being really intentional about when people are required to work. And then managing relationships. We can negotiate and set expectations with our partners, the people in our home, with our supervisors and our coworkers about, listen, I don't work outside 9 to 5. And then 9 to 5, I only work. Like, do not interrupt me unless it's an emergency, and vice versa. And these are negotiations. These aren't one-way conversations. And it feels conflicty, but it's really just a polite, direct conversation. It's negotiation. And you can revisit it over time if it's not working out. And so if these boundaries that you establish are violated, if you say, like, do not ask me to work outside 9 to 5, your supervisor does, follow up with the conversation, of why exactly was this necessary? We talked previously, we established this boundary, we agreed upon it. Do we need to change this boundary? Do we need to make some agreed upon exceptions? Or do we just need to strengthen it? Something like that. And then same thing on the supervisor side. And as coworkers, we can hold each other accountable here as well. We talked about flexibility, and I know I'm running short on time, but we know that schedule flexibility is really beneficial for people, especially if you have a demanding schedule. Maybe you're someone who teaches at night or has overnight responsibilities, so having flexibility there is beneficial. And even just having flexibility about when and where you work, just the availability of it is good for everyone, has positive mental health outcomes regardless of gender. And we see, I think, it needs that sense of control and autonomy. But using this flexibility has better mental health so far in the literature, largely only for women. Again, probably because disproportionately family demands fall towards women. We need to address that, guys, as society. But that's, we are where we're at. And so making sure, recognizing that this is an equity issue, that flexibility provision is great for everyone, but we're going to maybe have disproportionate use of flexibility, and making sure that people aren't being penalized for using flexible policies, right? Just because you're working primarily from home, you shouldn't be excluded from social activities or not being considered for promotion or raises, things along those lines. And we've talked about individualized deals at the supervisor level, really creating those negotiations, making sure that individuals can job craft and empowering them, enabling them to meet their own psychological needs. When you're doing things, again, be very clear, create a sense of justice, right? You want to be just in how information is given, making sure that everyone's given information in the same way. They don't have to find it out through the grapevine. Being just in how rewards and resources are distributed. Are rewards based on pay, on merit? Is it clear why people are getting different resources than other people? If you're creating individualized deals, there's a lot of tailoring that goes on. And so not everyone's going to have the exact same setup. And so just being clear and just in how that's being done. Obviously, treating people well, being just in how you're treating people, and then inviting participation in decision-making to whatever degree possible. And if it's not really possible to invite people to participate in the decision, make that clear why, or at least solicit their input or feedback about the decision if you're able to do something about it. The worst thing you can do is ask people for input and then ignore it. But be clear about like why you've made the decisions you've made. Results in fewer depressive symptoms, fewer sickness days. And then lastly, I think this is lastly, I hope this is lastly, we together as coworkers can create an environment of psychological safety where, again, it's something that I think has sort of made its way into pop culture, but just in case you haven't heard of it, psychological safety is feeling that you are able to take social risks and be vulnerable without fear of negative social outcomes, right? So this goes back to disclosing mental illness, mental health, or maybe your LGBTQ status, or maybe if you have concerns or suggestions for the workplace to improve the workplace, but you worry that if you bring them up, your supervisor is going to chew your head off, right? Because it's a my way or the highway attitude, something like that, right? And so we want to create psychological safety where that's not the case, where people know that they are free to be their authentic selves, they're free to speak up, bring their ideas to the workplace, and that they're not going to face negative social repercussion for that. It can improve trust in leaders and coworkers, creates that climate of authenticity, and helps improve the workplace, right? You are on the front lines, you're the ones doing the jobs, you know how to make things better. And so you can bring that to the table if you feel safe to do so. And again, it reduces burnout, emotional exhaustion, and depression. Boom, did it. We've got some time for questions. I want to make sure that there was time. I was very easily excited. So I just see that there's a bunch in the chat now. So let's see. what's here.
Thanks, Keaton. One quick thing in terms of the chat, one of the kind of pressing stressors for people at CUNY has been the ambiguity as to whether we're going to be working remote or fully in person in the spring. So if you have any strategies on how we can kind of address that with leadership, we greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, if you're upward advocating, right, you're obviously not the ones, I don't think, making these decisions, but maybe you have the ears of people making decisions. You can say, the sooner we know, that's taking a stressor off of our table so we can focus on our jobs, right? Having this ambiguity is literally draining resources, both time-wise and cognitively, that we could devote to actually getting our tasks done. But because this is still up in the air, we can't plan, we can't focus on our tasks, and that's problematic. And so hopefully you've made the business case in that respect. But then because this is something that is out of our hands, right? Until that decision is made, at the end of the day, you're not the decision makers. We can help each other engage in that emotional support, right? One risk here is co-rumination, where like I feel negative about something and you feel negative about something, and together we're just going to spiral about it. And so really kind of keeping each other in check and thinking like, you know what, this is not in our hands right now. Let's focus on something else. Let's focus on what we can control, and how can we together do that? I think that will also really help.
I see Teresa has her hand up.
Thank you. So Keaton, that's exactly what I was going to refer to. The slide you showed about like the quadrants of support.
Mm-hmm.
You said, I wrote down appraisal support. So exactly about how do we not downward spiral together about this rumination? It's killing us. It's killing me in terms of how do I focus on my job? But like this thing is looming over my head. I'm also a parent of 2 children like you are, and that is a big component here. But how do we lift each other up while acknowledging and naming this very difficult thing we're all dealing with? And I think that's why I'm trying to change my tune to like more, hey, let's voice our concern. Let's be supportive of each other, have each other's back, and even naming it to our colleagues in spaces like this, in every space we're together, like, hey, this sucks. We're dealing with this. We are together in this, and we don't have to be secretive about how stressful this is, because the bigger our sort of, if we have critical mass, we'll be more listened to.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so smart, and you hit the nail on the head. You're engaging in both sort of like task-oriented coping or that instrumental support, right? By saying like, let's get together, let's work together, let's focus on policies or suggestions that we can, as a group, put forward, and that gives people that sense of competence or autonomy, and that's really helpful. So I love that you're doing that. And then one thing that you asked was like, how do we not downward spiral, right? Like it's so easy to do that. Maybe you create a norm of setting a timer, right? Or having a phrase or something of, I would set a timer. Maybe it's just because I have a 2-year-old, and so everything is around a timer right now, but I think adults really benefit from it too. Growing up, my family was like, you get 5 minutes of sympathy. And I think we could do that here of, you know what, this does suck. Let's talk about it. Let's have a complaint session where you're going to set a 5-minute timer. Here's the timer, and let's just complain. And when that's over, we're going to focus on solutions. When that's over, we're going to focus on the task at hand. And that way you're recognizing that like this is bad, and emotional support, being able to express our emotions, that's important, but you're also making sure that there's a hard boundary there. So maybe creating that as a norm. It sounds a little janky, but like if you get buy-in, everyone's on page, you could say like, this is empirically supported or something like that. I think that can help as well. Cool.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I do the timer thing too. Yeah, everybody, you get that time right, because after that point, it's not going to be a productive vent. It's just going to it's going to just kind of go off on it, and it helps you focus on what are the things that are actually really bothering you. What are those, and yeah, each person gets their time, and then you work on the solution. Or again, you just listen. Maybe they don't want a solution. Maybe they just want to just say it, and that's fine.
And the flip side of the timer is making sure that that 5 minutes or however long it is protected for just venting, right? Like we are not doing any problem solving in this 5 minutes. This is just for complaining. And that makes it almost fun in a way of like, oh, okay, this is a space where like, you know what? I get to just say it. I get to just say it, and I'm going to get the benefit from it. And I don't have to worry about someone else trying to problem solve for me or reappraise for me. We're just in it together. I think that can be really helpful.
And I think to Peter's point, I think one of the kind of main takeaways from today's presentation is understanding that all of these things, when it comes to workplace stress, are individual, right? I think oftentimes organizations want to kind of take a cookie cutter approach, say we're going to do X to address whether it's whatever workplace issue across the board, not keeping in mind that the way something is going to impact one staff member is going to be very different from the other, and that the solution to target this one staff member is going to vary from the next staff member.
Absolutely. I will recommend too, if you're just interested, particularly in the remote work issue at large, Adam Grant's podcast, the Work Life podcast, I think that's what it's called, by TED, has an episode on remote work, and it's, I think, one of their best episodes, and thinking really through of how can we provide this in an equitable way, how can we make sure that it's done in a way that is beneficial to employees and recognizes that individuality. I know, again, you're not the policymakers, but maybe you can send that to the people who are having those discussions.
All right. Any final comments? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Keaton. We greatly appreciate your time as well as your insights. Just as an FYI for everyone, we'll be posting the video recording of this presentation no later than the end of the week on our website as well as on YouTube. And we'll also be sharing out the PowerPoint slides. Right, so thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again, Keaton. We, again, greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Thanks.
Take care. Have a good one.